You're listening to episode 137 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. The naked monk, Stephen Schettini, joins us to speak about personal evolution from religious Buddhism to secular practice. It's interesting, isn't it, how things change and yet so much remains the same. We have in our world, for example, not only ongoing lineages of religious Buddhism, but these traditions are growing alongside new, non-traditional forms. The development of secular Buddhism doesn't take away from or ruin tradition. It simply opens up new fields of exploration. And what an opportunity this is for us to learn. Our practice doesn't have to remain in one place, bound by the constraints of convention. We can and should investigate our options and understand that in different times and circumstances of our lives, we're going to incline to different approaches to engagement with moment-by-moment existence. In other words, what we do evolves. Stephen Schettini is founder and director of Quiet Mind Seminars. He's led hundreds of meditation workshops in the Montreal area since 2003 through www.thequietmind.org and has contributed columns regularly to local newspapers and to The Suburban, Quebec's largest English language weekly. He also freelanced for the Montreal Gazette. Stephen made a living in print communications and over the next 20 years authored, co-authored, illustrated, and designed dozens of books on information technology and health science. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice light roast coffee with a dash of hazelnut creamer. And our guest today is our dear friend, Stephen Schettini. Stephen, thank you for joining us again.
You're very welcome, Ted. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Always glad to have you on, and you have been on this podcast with us for episodes 43 and 68, and again with this one. And we wanted to talk about a couple of different things that was occurring recently. We have talked about your books, The Novice, and It Begins with Silence, The Art of Mindful Reflection. Today we're going to talk about some offerings you have on your newly designed site, thenakedmonk.com. Why don't you tell us about the website changes first, and then we'll go into the one-on-one.
Well, the website. The Naked Monk started, it was spawned about 4 years ago, I think. When I didn't really know what I wanted to do with it. I was just using it as a form of expression and to gauge some feedback to see what sort of stuff people would be interested in. And then gradually I became sort of more cognizant of social networking and the way these things work together, and the fact that this could be turned into a website with a much wider and more pragmatic goal, which is to really reach out to people and to connect and to establish a sort and I mean, I have an entity, I suppose, Stephen Schettini, but also to create this artificial thing, the Naked Monk, which hopefully would resonate. And that's something that I've been developing because it's based really on what people are looking for. And at the same time, it uses that image of the monk, of course, because I was a monk, but the naked in the sense that I'm no longer under the protection of a tradition. I no longer subscribe to any tradition. I'm a freelance person. At one point, I said a freelance Buddhist, but I'm not really a Buddhist anymore. I can't really justify calling myself that. So it's a blog which has many of the conventional things. I'm giving away a freebie in exchange for people's email address and trying to build up a mailing list. I use Twitter and Facebook and Google Plus to promote it and to try and get readers, and I get feedback, which is invaluable. And basically, it's a forum for me. It enables me to express what I'm thinking and to follow what I'm thinking as an ongoing process, which has been an up and down process. I went through a period of writer's block for a while, and I seem to be coming out of it with a renewed sense of purpose and direction.
Yeah, Stephen, something I wanted to ask about is that on your site, and just now you were talking about not calling yourself a Buddhist anymore, and that's been a progress to what your practice has been. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it was for you that was that distinguishing characteristic or moment that made you go, oh, that's not quite an accurate description anymore?
Well, I remember making that decision when I left the monastery back in 1982. Um, I stopped calling myself a Buddhist. And yet, as recently as a couple of years ago, or even a few months ago, I seem to still be making that statement. I'm not a Buddhist. It's as if I'm trying to prove something. Um, and I suppose that there's sometimes a sort of a defensiveness in there when I'm in contact with Buddhists and I discover that I actually have an enormous amount in common with them. We have all sorts of conversations which don't require a great deal of introduction because we're talking from the same basis and the same books, really, the Pali Canon. And we're interested in very many of the same concepts. But I also do believe that Buddhism, despite all the claims that it's scientific and it's really not a religion, um, my experience of the Buddhism that I went through with my Asian teachers is that it very much was a religion, and it still is.
Mhm.
And we might come back to a quote which the Dalai Lama's made in the last few days about needing to move beyond religion, but we'll get to that.
Yeah.
Uh, I think um, I'm not I'm not a believer. I don't believe, for example, in enlightenment. I want to, I'd love to, but the idea in enlightenment, yeah, or even full permanent awakening. I mean, what the Buddha claimed was quite audacious. He claimed that he had left behind all that stuff, period, and that his mind was permanently free. He didn't have to practice letting go anymore. Well, at least that's what it says. That's what it says in the Pali Canon. But at the same time, he used to periodically go back into the woods and spend time meditating and being by himself. What for? If he was already there.
Right.
Um, anyway, that's not my point. My point is not to analyze and debate the scriptures. My point is that in my experience, meditation, mindful practice, and mindful reflection has been of incredible value in my life. So I've got this connection to that. On the other hand, the thought that I would be in a position to stop doing that and I would never be troubled with my own mental wanderings anymore seems to me absurd. I can't conceive of it. I mean, I find habits of thoughts that I've developed as a child, as a very young child, that are still there. And they're not going away. I can deal with them. I have much better tools of dealing with them than I used to. But they're still there. They're emotionally embedded in my whole psyche. So that's one example. I don't really believe in enlightenment. I certainly don't believe in reincarnation. I don't particularly disbelieve in it either, for that matter.
Right.
Uh, so that there are things there which make it impossible for me to claim that I'm a Buddhist.
Now, one of the new offerings you have on the site is one-on-one. And why don't you tell us about that?
Well, one-on-one is simply an opportunity for people to speak to me about their issues. And as I said, there are really two camps. One is people who have questions about the meditative process, um, and they tend to be Buddhists or people who've been practicing or are interested in Buddhism. And that coincides with my own students here, where I teach up here around Montreal. Most of the people who come are interested in Buddhism, but not in becoming Buddhists. They feel that there's some value in there, but they don't want to join anything and they don't want to commit to a set of beliefs. They certainly don't want to delve into ancient Asian languages. They want something a little more than, you know, than a superficial gloss. They want some in-depth stuff, but they want it in their own language and they want it with plain examples. So um, that's reflected in the people who are coming to me for the one-on-one as well. They just want to talk about their own experience, put it into a context which bridges the old, the ancient Buddhist attitude with the modern reality of how we exist and how we think and how we express. Um, And for example, just this morning I had a question which you would never hear spoken. You wouldn't hear it spoken in this way in you know in a traditional Buddhist setting.
Mhm.
The person I was speaking to asked me, "What the hell does it mean to experience suffering?
Mhm.
Experience your suffering, or be with your suffering, or know suffering, whichever way you want to interpret it." And
Mhm.
it's a very deep question, and it's a very important question, and it's also a very simple question at the same time. It gets to the root of everything the Buddha was teaching, and it gets to the root of why Buddhism is of such great interest today too. So that's the one side of the well, one type of person I speak to, and then the other side. My own background was with Tibetan Buddhism, and Tibetan Buddhism is really the Catholic Church of Buddhism. It's It's full of ritual. It's full of, and I hope this doesn't offend people, but I can't avoid the word. It contains a great deal of superstition, and mixed in with that is a great deal of good common sense and grounded Buddhist philosophy. So people get into that for all sorts of reasons, and they get distracted in many ways. Especially people, I think, get distracted by the tantric aspect of Tibetan Buddhism. Um, Many teachers lead with the tantric connection and the guru-disciple relationship and the practice of guru yoga in a way which sort of puts the real, what for me is the real meat and potatoes, on the side.
Mhm.
And that's very attractive to people for a while because the Tibetans are really, they present very well. Let's put it that
Mhm.
way. But in time, these people realize, but no, this isn't why I'm here. I'm here for other reasons. But by then, they've got themselves involved with tantric initiation. They've made commitments which they can't keep or which they can't really relate to. And then there are the stories of the Vajra hells and the relationship with the community. If they leave their teacher, they lose everything. Some of them have invested years of their lives studying Tibetan and memorizing different sadhanas. And this is what I did, and this is what I broke away from. And so I totally understand this. And I can assure people that there is a way through this without losing your integrity. And the bottom line is that in the end, most of these Tibetan teachers will be friendly to you again anyway. They're not closed people. It's just that their ways are so different from ours that it causes some confusion at a certain point.
Mhm. And you've been involved in some conversations with monastics in that tradition who are Westerners who are struggling a bit with this cognitive dissonance of their cultural template that they grew up with and the traditions of the Tibetan practice. I mean, it's not to disparage those. It's just that those are very different, and there are some troubles adjusting to that.
Yeah, it's very important. I wrote a blog recently in which I confessed the opening words were, my name is Stephen, and I'm a Catholic.
Mhm.
Um, And this blog is really an acknowledgement that the story of it is that it's an acknowledgement that no matter what I think, what I want to think, what I will choose to believe, I was raised as a Catholic, and built into that are triggers and questions, never mind the answers, but there are questions built into that that are a part of my whole way of thinking. We can't ignore that. When we go as an adult to a tradition as complex and as sophisticated as Buddhism, as Tibetan Buddhism, um, sometimes we go with a wish to leave behind all the crap that we grew up with and that we carry along with us. And that's not doable. It's simply not doable. There is a clash of cultures in your own mind that has to be addressed.
Yeah, and the whole concept of reinventing oneself. One of my brothers has gone through this change where it's, oh, I want to reinvent myself, and he started going by a different name and dressing differently, and yet the same habit patterns, which are deeply ingrained in the mind, were still absolutely there. It was just a different set of clothing.
Yeah, discovering that is very disconcerting. When you finally face it, you realize, I'm just wearing a different hat here.
Mhm.
Um, but it's also, it can give you tremendous insight to, if you can swallow that and see what you've done and what you haven't done, and why you can do what you can and why you can't do what you're unable to do. That's a tremendous learning process.
Yeah, and I would suggest that that's probably one of the first steps in loosening their grip on the decisions that you make based on those templates that we have.
Yeah. Well, decision making now that's a whole other program we could talk about. But just to summarize it for those readers who haven't come into contact with it, actually, okay, the basic thing is that we make our decisions first and then rationalize them afterwards. Now, this is something that the Buddha taught in the teaching of the five skandhas. Feeling, or the sense of discriminating an experience as good or bad or indifferent, comes before the thoughts of how to deal with that.
Yep.
So the reaction comes directly from that judgment of good, bad, or indifferent. And in modern language, that simply means that we decide emotively, we act and decide what we're going to do, and then we come up with a reason for it afterwards.
Yeah. And in fact, not to go too far down the rabbit hole of science validating Buddhism, that's not what this is meant to support. But a recent study shows that there is brain activity on a particular decision in controlled conditions prior to the person even being aware that they have decided to take this action. So really on a neurological level as well, this is valid. So for people who are saying, "Oh, no, I make my decisions and then I go on them," not necessarily so.
I think very rarely, extremely rarely, when we're in a very rational state of mind, I think it might be possible. I think it is possible. I think when you're meditating and you get into that space between stimulus and response, I think that is something that we're trying to do there, which we're trying to think before we act. And it's possible. And I think people of all sorts have done that, not just Buddhists, and it wasn't just the Buddha who taught that. And I suspect, I can't really validate this, but I suspect that we've only fallen into the other way of thinking since the so-called Age of Reason. It's only in the last few centuries, I think, that we in the West have thought of ourselves as rational beings. We're now rediscovering the fact that we're not primarily anyway.
Yeah, yeah. Stephen, you brought something up earlier about people who are from a different culture and they're struggling with this idea of the guru devotion and that relationship. I was wondering if you could talk for a few minutes about your thoughts on where is that cutoff point, where is that line between the value that an experienced and knowledgeable supportive teacher can provide versus that devotion to a guru that is perhaps not helpful to one's practice. What have you seen and experienced in your years on this?
Well, I've seen a lot of Westerners try and fit the mold of the Asian guru-disciple relationship. That's my experience, and it doesn't work. Um, for a while, I thought that the guru-disciple thing was an anachronism, but I don't think it's that simple. It's not just something from a different time and place. There's a serious mismatch because as Westerners, we are all schooled in basic scientific thinking. I mean, we all have learned reading, writing, and arithmetic. We're also schooled in an attitude which is democratic. Now, we may not know what democracy is in detail, we may not study political science, but we have this sense of uh, we should be equal. We should be able to argue on an equal, on a level playing field. Even if you know more than I do about a particular subject, I'm still entitled to question you and doubt you and challenge you in any way that I can. Um, Now, having said that, I sort of think that that is really, in an ideal situation, what a traditional guru-disciple relationship should be like too. Um, Alex Berzin, on his website, the Berzin Archives, has translated this guide. I've forgotten what it's called now. Um, we can find it. You can put a link on the page to it afterwards, Ted. It's a guide to forming a relationship with your spiritual teacher. I read it a few years ago, and it's very detailed and it's very it describes the various types of teachers, the various there are preceptors who simply guide you along the guide you through the rules of Buddhism or of the particular style of Buddhism which you've chosen to live as a monk or whatever. And then there are teachers who impart theory and philosophy to you. And then there is the guru, which is a much deeper relationship. And that final relationship should only be formed after many years of reflection on both sides. Both should be investigating each other very carefully. So in theory, it sounds great. In practice, that doesn't happen very much. When you go into a Tibetan monastery and you see everybody else is practicing the whatever, the Vajrayogini sadhana, and you can't do that because you haven't been initiated. And you can't be initiated until you have a guru. So you want to catch up with all the others and you want to get to enlightenment in 3 years as quickly as possible. And so you jump into it. And the teachers, the Tibetan teachers, who should be saying, whoa, slow down, are just saying, okay, we'll give it to you. Because their attitude is not that you're actually going to receive the initiation, but that we're living in very degenerate times and things will never be the same as that they were during the time of the Buddha. And just to be in the room with somebody who's reciting this particular unintelligible text is a blessing on a subliminal level, which is the best we can hope for. And so that, is often a very well-intentioned approach, which is completely mismatched with the expectation of the student who thinks he's actually receiving a tantric initiation. But of course, the reception of a tantric initiation is a mental thing. It's something which happens in your mind. It's not just a matter of being at a ceremony. And so this triggers a whole an enormous amount of confusion in which you can't really cope without going into various areas of denial. And it often ends up as an absolute bloody mess. So it's very sad.
So I want to make sure that people understand, and I'll repeat this later at the conclusion, that you can find out more about the one-on-one process with Stephen on the website, thenakedmonk.com. It's linked right up on top, so you'll see that. So be sure to go check that out. Stephen, I wanted to ask you about a recent blog post of yours. This is one you just put out a couple of weeks ago as of this recording on the godless joys of iconoclasm. Talk to the audience a little bit about that. I think they'd be interested in hearing more about that. And the reason I bring that up is when I have put up quotes from you from your books or blog posts, they get a lot of very, very positive feedback on Facebook. In fact, I think Currently, the the greatest number of likes, over 100, was for one of your quotes from The Novice. So people are listening, and that's a lot of this same audience on Facebook as listen to the podcast. So I want to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about just this one posting.
Well, this posting was it was just it so far it's turned out to be a lot more significant for me than for any of my readers. Um, as I say, I use social media and Google Analytics and so forth to see what's happening in response to my blogs. And this didn't get a lot of, it didn't seem to create a lot of attention. My wife Caroline thinks it was a little too abstract or too complicated, and she's probably right. But for me, it was a culmination of ideas which I've had for a long time, which I've been trying to formulate, and it's sort of I've been going through not exactly a writer's block because I have been writing, but a sense that I needed to, or I was on the point of some sort of change in my direction. And this seems to encapsulate it. But it's tough. I accept that. Iconoclasm, as you probably know, and as your listeners probably know, is basically the breaking down of sacred symbols. Literally, it means to break an icon or to break a monument. And normally we associate that with religion. Nietzsche was a great iconoclast, the way he spoke about the Western tradition, Western religions. I think the Buddha was an iconoclast, certainly towards the Brahmins. He mocked them for trying to explain the inexplicable. And this is very powerful stuff because it helps you overcome a bias that you may have towards your inherited religion or your inherited culture and move on to a more creative view. But actually, iconoclasm can be applied to the new view just as well as to the old one. And it can leave you basically groundless without any foundation left at all. A sort of way of moving forward without direction in some sense. I don't think that's what it does. I think it does give tremendous direction, but it's a very scary process because in this blog I actually talk about things as varied as religion and atheism and science. These all come under the hammer, basically. My example of science is that we think of science as being completely objective, and it's a process of discovery. And yet, if we look at Einstein, who's probably not everybody would say he's the greatest scientist, but he's certainly the greatest figurehead or face of science in the 20th century. And he said that God didn't play dice. And for him, that was a belief. He had no evidence for that whatsoever. That was his firm belief. He was absolutely committed to it. He believed in the grand unified theory. He just couldn't let it go, despite all the evidence that was coming up to the contrary. Anyway, my point is not whether he was right or wrong. The point is that he used belief and he believed in intuition. And he spoke very freely about them. And I admire him for that. I think it's fantastic. But we have conceptions of things as being especially science has been described by some people as the religion of the 21st century. Of course, scientists take umbrage at this because, of course, science is not a religion. It doesn't involve belief. It's purely a process of discovery. It's entirely objective. Well, science is, yes, but scientists aren't.
Are human.
Scientists are human, and sometimes they're scientific, and sometimes they're just not. So life is more complicated than that.
Yeah, in fact, you touch upon one of the reasons I've left out science as a term that I use in our first take at putting definitions up on the wall as a starting point of discussion for secular Buddhism, because that's a process, and we're people, and people make mistakes, and we interpret data, and our methods may be sound, and they're the best that we've got, and they have a really good track record. But part of what makes them good and what makes them positive is they acknowledge we do make mistakes. We do interpret things, and that we need to build around checking ourselves because we're not able to get outside and truly have that kind of objective view because we're not objective. We're human beings, and that's why the process needs to take care of it with others taking a look at it and having double blinds. That's exactly why we do those kinds of things in that realm, which again will not tell us what we personally find of value in our experiences.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think our cultural direction that we're going in now, there's a tension in there between um, knowing what's correct and what is provable and what is true, and with finding value in our life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, this is a very old question, you know. If you read the Buddhist sutras or if you read the Bible, you'll see people who haven't gone through that, in other eras. But today we're still faced with the same problem. It's a perennial human preoccupation. And I think that's what we all have in common here, because I say I'm not a Buddhist, but I relate to Buddhists and I relate to all sorts of people because that's a thread in my life. But because I face that question, and I gravitate towards other people who face that question, like you, because that's what makes life interesting.
It is, and that's the wonderful diversity of our practice, is that it does extend outside of our own isolated communities, whatever those communities may be.
Yeah, yeah. I'm very um, how can I put this? One of the reasons I'm no longer a Buddhist or no longer call myself a Buddhist is because I don't want to be stuck inside those walls. I want to push those walls outwards. And that's exactly what the Dalai Lama seems to be suggesting in his latest quote on Facebook, which he's saying, in which he says he thinks it's a time to move beyond religion. Um, of course, he still remains an important religious leader, and I'm sure he'll die that way. But it's an interesting thing for him to say. And I think our language we don't need special terms. We don't need the word religion. We don't need to believe in specific things in order to have conversations about ethics and compassion and insight. It's just not necessary. We can do all that in the vernacular. It can become part of everyday life without having to be set apart as religion or as philosophy. Um, which is not to say that those fields of study are not useful. They are, but they also need to be opened up to the general public in general language, in plain, non-academic, non-exclusive language, because that's where life actually happens, and that's where we find its real meaning.
Very true, and I'm encouraged by what you have said, particularly along the lines of using this as a language that's going to reach others. Because if we keep using academic terms and we keep the conversation only with academics, then we're preaching to a very, very small choir.
No, don't get me started, Ted. I have a real issue with academic language and people who use long, complicated words. And instead of expressing their ideas, they slip in the name of some philosopher, usually dead or generally obscure, and assume that you know what that represents. This is not helpful, you know. If you're going to communicate with people, I learned about communication from the practice of typography. And the great typographer that I really valued more than any was Jan Tschichold. And he was a very strange person who wrote a book called The Morality of Good Type, which to many people is very strange. But his, his basic ethic is that you have to convey somebody else's message and you should be completely transparent. Nobody should know that you labored over this. Nobody should know that you even exist. And to me, that's what communication, that's my ideal of communication, is that you get the message through to people so they understand it, and they don't even care if you're there or not. And ideally it should sound like it's always, that phrase has always existed.
Yeah,
That's what communication should be.
you make a point in the blog post. I'm just going to read one line that you have in this that's called out, and it captured my interest because it is so very accurate. And you say, cliches become cliched because they harbor a germ of truth. Otherwise, they'd just fade away. Brilliantly said. Stephen, was there anything else you wanted for us to cover today?
Oh, I think that's enough. I think it was. I'm glad I was able to talk about one-on-one. It seems to have value for people there, and I would encourage people uh, to come and give it a shot. Take a look at my website anyway, and see if there's a section on about the talks on that site. You'll find the page, and you can read about it. And if you're interested, I would love to have discussions with as many people as possible, as widely as possible. It's a great joy.
And the website for folks listening is thenakedmonk.com. And I will also point out that on these blog posts, there is the ability to comment and have discussions. And Stephen does participate in those. So be sure to come in and check it out and take a look at the one-on-one. But I think particularly listeners of this podcast, you've enjoyed Stephen's quotes on the Facebook page. Come take a look at some of where they're coming from on the blog post. Guest today, Stephen Schettini. Stephen, thank you so much for being here. A joy to speak with you as always.
Thanks a lot, Ted. You take care now.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.